In tonight's news edition, His Majesty the King holds a series of meetings with world leaders and top officials before addressing the UN General Assembly. Syria's president accuses the United States of trying to find excuses for war. And Kenyan security forces launch an assault on a shopping complex in an attempt to break a deadly siege. Good evening and welcome to the news. His Majesty the King held a series of meetings in New York with world leaders, heads of delegations and political figures before addressing the 68th session of the United Nations General Assembly. King Abdullah and Austrian President Heinz Fischer discussed Jordanian-Austrian ties, the Syrian crisis and the Palestinian-Israeli peace process. The King stressed world consensus to reach a political transition in Syria to end the spiral of violence and bloodshed and safeguard the country's unity. During the meeting attended by His Royal Highness Crown Prince Al Hussein and other senior officials, the King spoke about the burdens on Jordan for hosting a huge number of Syrian refugees. King Abdullah and former US President Bill Clinton discussed Syria and Palestinian-Israeli peacemaking. The King called for international action to arrive at a political solution in Syria and also build on US-led efforts to make tangible progress in the Palestinian-Israeli peace process. Earlier in the day, the King discussed with US Secretary of State John Kerry developments in the region with a focus on Syria and the recently reconvened Palestinian-Israeli peace talks. Kerry hailed Jordan's efforts and updated the King on his efforts in the negotiations currently underway between the Palestinians and Israelis. His Royal Highness Prince Faisal bin Hussein, the Regent, met a team representing the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. They tackled the situation in the Middle East and prospects for forging closer cooperation between Jordan and the military alliance. Prince Faisal spoke about the kingdom's support for efforts to end the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and achieve the two-state solution and to find a political solution to the Syria crisis. The regent pointed to the burden shouldered by the kingdom as a result of hosting a large number of Syrian refugees. Members of the NATO team lauded Jordan's comprehensive reforms and His Majesty the King's support for efforts to bring about regional peace and stability. Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour briefed the NATO Parliamentary Assembly delegation on the reforms taking place in the kingdom. Mansour said His Majesty the King had spearheaded the reform drive that saw the national constitution being amended to enhance the separation of powers, boost the lower house's role and bolster freedoms and democracy. He said political reform is proceeding in tandem with socio-economic reforms, pointing to economic challenges facing the kingdom due to scarce resources. Lower House Speaker Saad Hail Sroor also told the NATO parliamentary delegation that the reform process is moving forward at a steady pace. He said a third of the constitution had been amended and legislation passed to realize the aspired for change, including the setting up of the Constitutional Court and an independent election commission. The House Speaker said the reform process needs a constant updating of legislation regulating political and economic life to enhance public participation in the decision-making process. Acting Senate President Abdul Rauf al-Rawabdi also spoke to the delegation about the need to help solve regional disputes by peaceful means. Interior Minister Hussein al-Majali said the NATO parliamentary team's visit was to learn firsthand about the conditions of Syrian refugees in Jordan and the effect of the crisis on the vital service sectors. Jordan condemned recent violence in Iraq, Pakistan and Kenya as acts of terrorism. Minister of State for Media Affairs and Communications, Mohammed al-Momani, reiterated the kingdom's position in rejecting all acts of terrorism and violence, regardless where they come from or the motives behind them. He deplored the targeting of innocent civilians in such attacks. Momani expressed the kingdom's solidarity with the people of Iraq, Pakistan and Kenya to stand up against terrorism. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad said his government will allow international experts access to its chemical weapons sites. But he cautioned that rebels might block them from reaching some of the locations. In an interview with Chinese state television, the Syrian leader denounced the United States, France and Britain for submitting a draft resolution to the United Nations Security Council to place Syrian chemical weapons under international control. He said the Western powers were fighting what he called an imaginary enemy. The Syrian president said Syria already handed over a list of chemical weapons to an international agency. He pledged his government will ensure that experts arrive at the places where the chemical weapons are produced and stored. The revelations of Syria's chemical weapons arsenal became public after an August attack near Damascus that killed 1,400 people.
We don't see any problems, but as I said, if these terrorists are ordered by some countries to take action against the inspectors to prevent them from doing their job with the goal of blaming the government of Syria, and as you know, these terrorists move all around, they are not just in one place, so this remains a possibility. But so far it's just a possibility.
World leaders are still divided on how to deal with the Syrian crisis. Syria's civil war was on the agenda at a meeting between U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and British Foreign Secretary William Hague on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Kenyan security forces have launched an assault on a shopping complex in the capital Nairobi in an attempt to break a deadly three-day siege. Gunfire is continuing at the mall where suspected Al-Shabaab militants remain holed up. Kenyan forces said 2 of some 15 militants holding hostages in the mall were shot dead and all escape routes sealed off, with troops now focusing on clearing the building. Faraj Loni has an update.
Thick smoke pours from a besieged Nairobi mall. Kenyan officials say their forces were closing in on Islamists holding hostages 3 days after raid by Somalia's Al-Shabaab killed at least 62 people. 2 of the 10 to 15 militants holding hostages in the upscale Westgate Mall were shot dead in fierce fighting during the rescue attempt. Kenyan security forces were stepping up their efforts against the gunmen in an effort to end the stalemate.
I am aware that indications are that the building have been blown off, but nothing could be further from the truth. We want to assure Kenyans that our forces are in full control of this situation, and we are certain in no time that the fire will be put off.
It remained unclear how many gunmen and hostages were still cornered in the shopping center, 2 hours after a series of loud explosions and gunfire were followed by a plume of black smoke that grew in volume from one part of the complex. Kenya's interior minister told a news conference that the militants, all men, though some wore women's clothing during the assault, had set afire with mattresses on the mall's lower floors. 2 of the hostage takers had been killed today and another assailant died on Saturday. Security officials near the scene have said the blasts heard at lunchtime were caused by Kenyan forces blasting away and after President Uhuru Kenyatta had dismissed the demand to pull Kenyan forces out of neighboring Somalia. Al-Shabaab have warned they would kill hostages if police moved in, echoing other officials who have been at pains to highlight successes in rescuing hundreds of people trapped and terrified after Saturday's massacre. Faraj Luni for the news at 10.
Over to Egypt, where a court has banned any activity by the Muslim Brotherhood and ordered its funds seized. It was a significant move in a campaign to crush ousted President Mohamed Morsi's Islamist movement. The case was brought by a lawyer from the leftist party on the grounds of protecting Egyptians from violence. Hebron has more in this report.
In a decisive move against Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, a Cairo court banned all activities by the Islamist group and ordered its funds seized. The Cairo Court for Urgent Matters said the ruling applied to the Brotherhood, its non-governmental organization, and any affiliated groups. It also ordered the interim government to seize the group's funds and form a panel to administer its frozen assets until any appeal had been heard. The military-backed government is waging the toughest crackdown in decades on the Islamist group, which says it has 1 million members. The ruling did not specifically mention the Brotherhood's political wing, the Freedom and Justice Party. But the move effectively outlaws the movement, which has seen hundreds of its members killed and thousands arrested since the army overthrew Morsi in July. The lawyer who filed the case said the verdict was just.
The judge did not violate what's right. Thus, it is a correct verdict. A verdict issued by a judge asked to act urgently. It is his right to issue a verdict in an urgent case to restrict all activities that are potentially harmful.
Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's toppling of Morsi has triggered a political crisis in the Arab world's most populous state, with the Brotherhood insisting that a military coup robbed them of power. The court decision is likely to drive more Brotherhood members underground, and it may encourage young Islamists to take up arms against the state. Hiba Al-Atoum for the News at 10.
Israeli forces tightened security around the occupied West Bank city of Hebron after the death of a soldier in a shooting. Palestinians said troops raided their homes and hundreds have been arrested for questioning. Luay Balkar has an update.
Tension rose across the Israeli-occupied West Bank despite the resumption of US-brokered peace talks. Israeli soldiers were patrolling the streets around the city of Hebron a day after an Israeli soldier was shot dead during a Jewish holiday. He was the second soldier killed since Friday by suspected Palestinian gunmen. The occupied city of Hebron is a hotbed of tensions where some 500 Israeli settler families live among 100,000 Palestinians and carry out repeated provocations against the city's Arab population. The attack occurred as Hebron was packed with Jewish visitors for a week-long Jewish holiday. Thousands, mainly extremist settlers and ultra-Orthodox Jews, were expected to attend a musical festival. The Israeli military said the soldier had died in a hospital in Jerusalem after a suspected sniper shot him in the neck while he was on patrol near the Ibrahimi Mosque. Military troops were beefed up in Hebron after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responded to the killing with an order to permit settlers into an Arab-owned building near the scene of the attack. Palestinians living near the site said Israeli troops raided their homes in the early morning hours and held around 300 people in custody.
At 2 o'clock in the morning, the soldiers knocked from the balcony side of the house. I did not open, so they broke down the door and broke the glass. They went to the living room and turned over the couches and the seats. And they went into my bedroom and turned everything upside down and broke everything.
Residents showed bedrooms with items in disarray, closets opened and mattresses turned over. Bilal al-Qarati, another resident of Hebron, said Israeli troops raided his house, tore it upside down and arrested his brother and his children. Netanyahu issued a statement after the soldier died, vowing to strengthen the settlement building in the occupied West Bank, and settlers moved back into a building Israel evacuated in Hebron in April 2012. The United States condemned the killing of the soldiers and said such violence undermined efforts to establish a positive atmosphere for peace negotiations to progress. Luay Balkar for the News at 10.
German Chancellor Angela Merkel began trying to persuade her centre-left rivals to keep her in power. Her bids come after her Conservatives notched up their best election result in more than 2 decades. But the Conservatives looked set to end just short of an absolute majority in Parliament with about 42%. Deprived of the Free Democrats' FDP's company, Merkel may have to repeat her grand coalition with the centre-left Social Democrats. Heading into a third 4-year term, Merkel told reporters in Berlin that Germany's policy on Europe will not change.
We made very clear today that nothing will change in our Europe policy. We carried out this election campaign according to our convictions, and we will continue this way. The Europe policy is part of our core values and will always be, and it will be continued in the same spirit.
The strongest storm to hit the Western Pacific this year brought heavy rain and winds as it moved into southern China's Guangxi region. Local meteorological authorities said Typhoon Usagi moved into Guangxi region around midday after it eased to tropical depression. Schools in Wuzhou city were closed after the local government issued typhoon alert. Flooding and gale force winds triggered by the typhoon have left 25 people dead after it made landfall in southern China's Guangdong province last night. Usagi hit the eastern city of Chaozhou in the province, with trees uprooted and power supply cut off. About 250,000 people were relocated and over 3.5 million affected after Usagi struck the province. Oracle Team USA is making an America's Cup comeback against Emirates Team New Zealand that last week looked all but impossible. In Sunday's first race, Oracle had the edge at the starting gun, then pushed New Zealand toward the course boundary line before rounding the first mark. It used this advantageous position to open a lead that the Kiwis were unable to close, despite closing to within a boat length on the third leg. In the day's second matchup, New Zealand continued to struggle to outmaneuver the increasingly agile Oracle team. Oracle now needs to win another 4 races against New Zealand to secure the cup. Estudiantes and Gimnasia drew 1-1 in a Plata derby marred by 2 red cards and a 10-minute delay as the pitch was showered with Tika tape. Gimnasia took the lead with Jose Correa connected a corner to Pounds from close range in the 22nd minute. Gimnasia were punished when defender Facundo Oreja was judged to have handled the ball and received a red card for a second offence. Estudiantes seized the opportunity and after the following free kick was partially saved by Monetti, Matias tapped in from the rebound to equalise in the 61st minute. The 1-1 draw left Gimnasia La Plata in 4th place, while Estudiantes are 9th in the standings led by Newell's Old Boys. Finally, to check what the weather will be up to in the next 24 hours. Chilly tonight in hilly areas and pleasant elsewhere with southwesterly moderate to brisk winds. A slight drop in temperatures is in the forecast tomorrow. Partly cloudy skies and a chance for scattered showers, especially in the country's north. Temperatures in Amman will hover around the mid-20s, while winds will be northwesterly brisk and blowing dust in the desert region. Further south, the Gulf of Aqaba should expect a relatively hot day tomorrow with northerly brisk winds and slightly choppy seas. The weatherman warns of poor visibility in the Badia region due to dust. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. Now our top stories once again. His Majesty the King holds a series of meetings with world leaders and top officials before addressing the UN General Assembly. Syria's president accuses the United States of trying to find excuses for war. And Kenyan security forces launch an assault on a shopping complex in an attempt to break a deadly siege. And that's the end of tonight's news. I'm Radle Bush. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.